You're serious? Andrew McAllister leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the scotch in his glass. The private club in Houston was buzzing with low murmurs, but his table of four stood out, roaring with laughter. Dead serious, chuckled Nathan, a stockbroker with a penchant for pushing limits. You've got everything, Andrew. Money, cars, houses. But you've never dared to go beyond your comfort zone. Andrew smirked, his sharp jaw tightening. And marrying someone is your idea of shaking things up? Come on, Nathan. Be more creative. Nathan's grin widened. Not just anyone. We're talking about someone who would make society raise its eyebrows. Someone who doesn't fit this. He gestured around the posh club. Picture-perfect world you live in. You mean someone unattractive, Andrew replied bluntly. Unconventional, Nathan corrected with mock sincerity. It's not about looks. It's about stepping out of your shallow bubble and proving you can make it work. Of course, there's a wager. A cool $5 million. The other two men at the table erupted in cheers, their laughter bouncing off the polished walls. Andrew drained his glass. All right, he said, slamming the empty tumbler on the table. I'll do it. But let's make one thing clear. I don't fail. Then you've got 30 days to find your bride, Nathan said, raising his glass in a mock toast. The small cafe in Rosewood was nothing like the extravagant restaurants Andrew frequented. It smelled of coffee and cinnamon, the walls adorned with mismatched frames of local artwork. He hadn't planned on being there. His car had broken down on the way to a business meeting, and this was the only place open while he waited for a tow. Welcome to Clara's Coffee Corner. A warm voice greeted him as he entered. Behind the counter stood a woman who didn't flinch at his tailored suit or the impatient scowl he wore. She was tall, with a broad figure and a confident presence. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, and her apron was dusted with flour. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with kindness. "Just a black coffee," Andrew said curtly, glancing around for a seat. Coming right up, she didn't rush, moving with a calm efficiency that seemed to irritate him further. As she handed him the coffee, he caught sight of a flyer taped to the counter. It advertised a fundraiser for a community center. "You're behind this?" he asked, gesturing to the flyer. "Sure am," she said proudly, trying to raise enough to open a safe space for kids after school. "It's a big dream for a small-town girl, but I'm determined." Andrew studied her for a moment. She was the opposite of everything he surrounded himself with, unpolished, unpretentious, and completely unbothered by his demeanor. A thought crept into his mind. Is it working? The fundraiser? It's slow, she admitted, her smile faltering slightly. But I'm not giving up. Andrew set his cup down. What if I told you I could fund the entire thing? Her eyes widened. Excuse me? On one condition, he said, his voice steady. You marry me. She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. That's not funny. I'm not joking, Andrew said. You need money, and I need a wife. It's a business deal. 1 year, and you'll have your center fully funded. Clara crossed her arms, her expression hardening. You think I'm desperate enough to agree to something like that? Think about it, Andrew said. Standing up, he handed her a business card. You've got my number. Call me if you change your mind. He left without another word, leaving Clara to grapple with the absurdity of his offer. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table, the card in her hand. The cafe had barely turned a profit that month, and the community center felt further away than ever. She hated the idea of being part of someone's scheme, but the weight of her dream pressed heavy on her shoulders. After hours of deliberation, she picked up the phone. Andrew McAllister, his voice answered smoothly. This is Clara, she said, her voice steady. Let's talk terms. Clara leaned back in her chair, gripping the phone tightly. Her mind was racing, but her voice remained calm. I'm not agreeing to anything yet, she said. If we're doing this, I need to know exactly what you expect from me. Andrew's voice on the other end was confident, unshaken. It's simple. We get married, stay together for 1 year, and in return, I fund your community center. I'll cover all expenses, construction, maintenance, staffing, whatever it takes. At the end of the year, we part ways. No strings attached. No strings attached, Clara repeated, skepticism lacing her tone. "And what's in it for you?" "A wife," Andrew said bluntly. "For appearances. That's all. You won't have to pretend to love me or act like this is anything more than a contract." Clara snorted. "You're not even trying to sugarcoat it, are you?" "I'm a businessman, Clara. I don't believe in wasting time." She set the phone down on speaker and stared at it, her heart pounding. The offer was insane, yet she couldn't deny how tempting it was. The fundraiser for the community center had raised barely a fraction of what was needed, and while Andrew's motives were clearly selfish, the opportunity was real. "What about my life?" she asked, her voice firm. "I'm not about to give up everything just to be paraded around as your wife. I have a business to run. You can keep running the cafe," Andrew assured her. "I won't interfere with your day-to-day life. The only thing I'll need is for you to attend certain events with me. Charity galas, corporate dinners, things like that." "Think of it as public appearances." Clara hesitated. "And how do I know you'll keep your end of the bargain?" "I'll put it in writing," Andrew said, his tone suggesting this was a trivial detail. "You'll have a contract that guarantees full funding for your community center, no matter what happens." For a moment, Clara imagined it. Seeing the kids in her town playing safely, attending workshops, and finding opportunities they'd never had before. The vision made her heart ache, but she wasn't about to let Andrew take advantage of her without some ground rules. "All right," she said cautiously, "but I have conditions." "Go on." "First, no surprises. I want to know in advance about every event or appearance you expect me to attend." "Done." "Second, you don't get to treat me like your employee. If we're doing this, it's as equals." Andrew chuckled softly. "You have my word." "And third," she said, her voice sharpening, "you'll keep this arrangement private. I don't want anyone knowing this is a deal. Not your friends, not the press. No one." Andrew paused. "Agreed." Clara exhaled, her grip on the phone relaxing slightly. "I'll need that contract in my hands before I say yes." "I'll have my lawyer draft it and send it over by tomorrow," Andrew replied smoothly. "You'll have everything in writing." For a moment, the line was silent. Then Andrew spoke again, his voice softer but still calculated. "You're making the right choice, Clara." She wasn't so sure. "We'll see." The contract arrived the next morning, delivered in a sleek black envelope. Clara spread the papers across her kitchen table, reading each line carefully. True to his word, Andrew had laid everything out in clear, concise terms. There were no hidden clauses, no fine print to trip her up. If anything, the document was unervingly professional, as though she were signing up for a job rather than a marriage. Still, doubts lingered. What kind of man made an offer like this? And why had he chosen her? The questions swirled in her mind, but she pushed them aside. The kids in her community needed this center more than she needed answers. By the time the cafe closed that evening, Clara had made up her mind. She dialed Andrew's number, her fingers trembling slightly. "I've read the contract," she said when he answered. "I'll do it." "Good," Andrew replied, his tone brisk. "We'll set up a meeting to make it official. Are you free tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" Clara said, startled. "This fast?" "No point in waiting," he said. "I'll arrange everything. Be ready." The next day, Clara found herself in a sleek downtown office, seated across from Andrew and his lawyer. The formalities were quick, almost clinical. She signed her name on the dotted line, her heart pounding with every stroke of the pen. As they finished, Andrew extended his hand. "Welcome to the partnership," he said, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Clara shook his hand, her grip firm. "Just remember, I'm not here for you. I'm here for them." Andrew smiled faintly, but his expression gave nothing away. "Understood." As she left the office, contract in hand, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she just stepped into a world far more complicated than she'd anticipated. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, an intimate ceremony held in Andrew's sprawling estate on the outskirts of Houston. Clara had expected something gaudy and over the top, but Andrew had kept it simple, at least by his standards. A small group of his closest business associates attended, along with a few of Clara's friends from the cafe. The entire event was meticulously planned, a performance for appearances. Clara adjusted the modest white dress Andrew's stylist had chosen for her. Standing in front of a full-length mirror in the estate's guest suite, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to. "Ready?" a smooth voice asked behind her. She turned to find Andrew standing in the doorway, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. He looked every bit the billionaire, confident, composed, and untouchable. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, lifting her chin. Andrew nodded. "Remember, this is just for show. You don't have to do anything you're uncomfortable with." His words were oddly considerate, but Clara wasn't about to be fooled by surface politeness. "Let's get this over with." The ceremony itself was brief. Clara's heart pounded as she walked down the aisle, her arm linked with her best friend, Lisa, who gave her a reassuring squeeze. Andrew stood at the altar, his expression unreadable, flanked by a minister who had clearly been hired to keep things efficient. As the vows were exchanged, Clara couldn't help but notice how Andrew avoided her eyes. It was as though he were going through the motions of a business transaction. She felt the same, repeating the scripted words without attaching meaning to them. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, there was polite applause from the small crowd. Andrew leaned in for the obligatory kiss, his lips brushing hers lightly before he pulled back, already focused on the next step. "Congratulations, Mrs. McAllister," he said with a faint smile, his tone devoid of warmth. Clara plastered on a smile of her own. "Let's hope this is worth it." The reception was held in the estate's grand dining room, where an elegant dinner had been prepared by Andrew's private chef. Clara found herself seated at the head table next to Andrew, enduring endless small talk with his associates. They were polite but distant, clearly unsure of how to engage with someone outside their social circle. Clara noticed Nathan among the guests, his smug grin making her stomach churn. She had learned about him through overheard conversations and couldn't shake the feeling that he was the instigator of whatever game Andrew was playing. "So, Clara," Nathan said, leaning forward with a glint of amusement in his eyes, "what's it like being married to the most eligible bachelor in Texas?" Clara gave him a tight smile. "Ask me again in a year." Andrew interjected smoothly. "Nathan, why don't you tell us about your latest venture? I'm sure everyone's dying to hear about it." Nathan chuckled but took the hint, redirecting the conversation. Clara shot Andrew a glance, surprised by his intervention. He met her gaze briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the room. Later that evening, when the guests had left and the house had grown quiet, Clara found herself alone in one of the estate's many guest bedrooms. She had insisted on separate rooms, a condition Andrew had readily agreed to. She sank into the plush armchair by the window, staring out at the sprawling gardens illuminated by soft outdoor lights. The enormity of what she had just done hit her like a wave. She was married, to a man she barely knew, in a world she didn't understand, all for the sake of a dream that now felt impossibly far away. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said reluctantly. Andrew stepped inside, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over one arm. He looked less like the polished billionaire she'd seen all day and more like a man carrying the weight of his own choices. "I wanted to check in," he said. "Make sure you're settling in." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Settling in? Andrew, this isn't exactly a normal situation." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Fair point. Look, I know this isn't easy for you, but I meant what I said. If there's anything you need, let me know." Clara studied him for a moment, searching for cracks in his carefully constructed facade. "Why did you really do this?" Andrew hesitated, his usual confidence faltering slightly. "Does it matter? You're getting what you want, and so am I." "It matters to me," Clara said firmly. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer, but then his expression hardened. "Good night, Clara." He left before she could say another word, leaving her alone with her thoughts once again. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Clara made a silent vow. No matter what Andrew's reasons were, she wouldn't let this arrangement define her. She had entered this marriage for one purpose, to build a better future for her community, and she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all Andrew McAllister, stand in her way. The following week, Clara received her first introduction to Andrew's world of high society, a black-tie charity gala in downtown Houston. Andrew had casually informed her over breakfast, sliding a sleek invitation across the table. "You'll need to clear your schedule," he said without looking up from his phone. "We're expected to make an appearance." Clara raised an eyebrow. "We? Is this one of those public appearances you mentioned?" "Precisely," he replied, still engrossed in his screen. "It's a fundraiser for an environmental initiative. Smile, nod, and endure the small talk. It'll be over before you know it." Clara folded her arms. "You make it sound like torture." "You'll see." On the evening of the event, a team of stylists descended upon Clara like vultures. They fussed over her hair, makeup, and wardrobe, turning the modest cafe owner into someone unrecognizable. The gown they selected was emerald green, sleek and elegant, paired with sparkling jewelry that felt foreign against her skin. As Clara stepped out of the dressing room, Andrew was waiting in the grand foyer, dressed in a classic black tuxedo. He glanced up from his watch, his gaze briefly lingering on her. "You clean up well," he said simply. "Gee, thanks," Clara replied, adjusting the delicate straps of her dress. "I feel like a doll someone's playing dress-up with." Andrew smirked. "Better get used to it." The gala was held at an exclusive downtown venue, its glittering chandeliers and sprawling ballroom a stark contrast to the warm familiarity of Clara's cafe. As they entered, all eyes turned to them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Clara felt the weight of their stares like a physical force. Andrew leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Relax. They're curious, not hostile." "Easy for you to say," Clara muttered through a tight smile. He placed a hand lightly on her back, guiding her through the crowd. Clara fought the urge to pull away, knowing this was all part of the performance. They stopped to greet a group of Andrew's acquaintances. The men offered polite handshakes, while the women assessed Clara with thinly veiled curiosity. "And who is this lovely addition to your life, Andrew?" asked a woman in an impossibly expensive-looking gown. "This is Clara, my wife," Andrew said smoothly, his tone practiced. Clara extended her hand, keeping her expression neutral. "Pleasure to meet you." The woman's smile was thin. "Likewise. Andrew has been quite the enigma when it comes to his personal life. You must be someone very special to have captured his attention." Clara matched her tone, sensing the subtext. "I suppose I just have a way of surprising people." Andrew's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile. As the night wore on, Clara fell into a rhythm of polite nods and superficial conversation. She quickly realized that most of the people at the gala were less interested in her and more focused on their own self-promotion. But there were moments that tested her patience. One man, a venture capitalist with an overinflated sense of importance, leaned in too close during a conversation. "So, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "what do you do when you're not dazzling the Houston elite?" "I run a cafe," Clara replied evenly. The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. "A cafe? How quaint." Clara smiled tightly. "It's not just a cafe. It's a hub for the community. We host workshops, fundraisers, and events for kids. It's small, but it makes a difference." Andrew, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped in. "She's being modest. Clara's work has had a measurable impact on her community, something most of us here could learn from." The man's smug grin faltered. Clara shot Andrew a quick glance, surprised by his defense. By the time they left the gala, Clara's feet ached, and her patience was worn thin. The car ride back to the estate was quiet, the tension between them palpable. "You handled yourself well tonight," Andrew said eventually. "Thanks," Clara replied. Her tone clipped. "It wasn't exactly a dream evening, but I survived." Andrew chuckled softly. "That's more than most people manage their first time in that crowd." Clara turned to face him. "Why did you defend me back there? With that guy?" Andrew shrugged, his gaze focused out the window. "Because he was wrong, and because I can't afford to have anyone questioning this arrangement. You're part of my life now, whether I like it or not." Clara frowned, unsure how to interpret his words. "Well, thanks, I guess." He didn't respond, and the rest of the ride passed in silence. That night, as Clara removed her jewelry and let her hair down, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was different, still herself, but shaped by the edges of Andrew's world. She wondered how long she could play this role without losing sight of who she really was. The days following the gala settled into an uneasy routine. Clara juggled her time between running the cafe and fulfilling Andrew's requests for public appearances. Though he kept his word and didn't interfere with her business, she couldn't escape the growing sense that her life was no longer her own. One morning, as Clara sorted through invoices at the cafe, her best friend Lisa burst through the door. "Okay, spill," Lisa demanded, plopping down into the seat across from her. Clara looked up, startled. "Spill what?" "Don't play dumb," Lisa said, her voice brimming with curiosity. "You married a billionaire, Clara. I've been waiting for the juicy details, and you've been radio silent." Clara sighed, setting down her pen. "It's not what you think, Lisa." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Oh? So you're not living in a mansion with a private chef and enough money to make Jeff Bezos jealous?" "I am, but it's complicated." "Complicated how?" Lisa asked, leaning forward. Clara hesitated, the weight of the contract pressing against her thoughts. "It's more like a business deal than a marriage." Lisa's jaw dropped. "A business deal? Clara, what did you get yourself into?" "It's for the community center," Clara said quickly. "Andrew agreed to fund it if I agreed to this arrangement. 1 year, and then we go our separate ways." Lisa stared at her, stunned. "You're serious? You married this guy for money?" "It's not like that," Clara said defensively. "I'm doing this for the kids. The center is everything I've dreamed of, and this was the only way to make it happen." Lisa shook her head. "I don't know, Clara. This feels like a huge gamble." Clara met her gaze. "I know, but it's a gamble I'm willing to take." Later that week, Andrew arrived at the cafe unannounced. Dressed casually in a button-down shirt and slacks, he looked out of place among the regulars sipping their coffee and reading newspapers. "Andrew," Clara said, surprised to see him. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, glancing around. "Somewhere private." Clara led him to the back office, closing the door behind them. "What's going on?" "There's another event coming up," Andrew said, his tone brisk. "A corporate dinner with some key investors. It's important that you're there." Clara crossed her arms. "Why didn't you just call or text me?" "Because this is serious," Andrew said. "These investors are crucial to my company's next big project. I need everything to look perfect, including us." Clara frowned. "Us?" "Andrew, you do realize how ridiculous this all sounds, right?" "It doesn't matter how it sounds," Andrew said sharply. "What matters is that they believe it." Clara sighed, rubbing her temples. "Fine, I'll be there. But you owe me for this." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Owe you? What exactly do you want?" "Come to the cafe's fundraiser next week," Clara said. "If I'm going to play your perfect wife, you can at least show some support for the community center." Andrew hesitated, then nodded. "Deal." The corporate dinner was as stiff and formal as Clara had expected. Andrew was in his element, effortlessly navigating conversations with the investors and charming them with his polished demeanor. Clara played her part, smiling and laughing at the right moments, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was a prop in his carefully orchestrated world. During a lull in the conversation, she leaned toward Andrew. "Do you ever get tired of this?" she whispered. "Tired of what?" he asked, his tone guarded. "Pretending," Clara said. "Acting like you have it all together when, deep down, you probably hate this as much as I do." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the investors, resuming his performance with renewed vigor. Clara watched him, a pang of sympathy creeping into her chest. For all his wealth and power, Andrew seemed just as trapped as she was. True to his word, Andrew attended the cafe's fundraiser the following week. He arrived late, dressed in a crisp blazer that made him stand out among the casual crowd. The moment he stepped inside, heads turned and whispers rippled through the room. Clara braced herself, unsure of how the locals would react to his presence. Andrew approached the donation table, pulling out a checkbook. "How much do you need to reach your goal?" he asked. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "What? How much?" he repeated, pen poised over the check. Andrew, that's not the point, she said. This fundraiser is about bringing the community together, not just writing a check. He hesitated, then nodded, slipping the checkbook back into his pocket. Fine. What can I do to help? Clara stared at him, surprised by his sincerity. You could start by serving coffee, she said, half joking. To her astonishment, Andrew rolled up his sleeves and stepped behind the counter. The sight of the billionaire pouring coffee and chatting with customers drew a mixture of laughter and admiration from the crowd. Clara couldn't help but smile as she watched him. For the first time, Andrew seemed genuinely at ease, free from the pressures of his usual world. As the night wound down, Clara approached him. Not bad for your first shift. Andrew smirked. Don't get used to it. Too late, she said, her smile softening. Thanks for coming. It meant a lot. Andrew met her gaze, his expression uncharacteristically earnest. It was different, but not terrible. Clara laughed, shaking her head. High praise coming from you. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the tension between them easing just slightly. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward, a crack in the facade they both worked so hard to maintain. The morning after Andrew's visit to the cafe, Clara tried to shake off the unsettling feelings lingering from their conversation. She threw herself into work, hoping the steady rhythm of brewing coffee and serving customers would drown out her thoughts. But as the hours passed, snippets of her exchange with Andrew crept back into her mind. By the time the cafe closed, her usual exhaustion was accompanied by an unusual restlessness. She couldn't stop questioning the sincerity of Andrew's actions. Was he genuinely trying to connect with her? Or was this all just part of his performance to make their arrangement appear legitimate? That evening, Andrew was waiting in the estate's kitchen when Clara returned home. He sat at the counter with a glass of wine, scrolling through his phone. The sight of him there, so casual and at ease, caught her off guard. You're home early, she said, setting her bag down. I decided to skip the usual networking dinner, Andrew replied, looking up briefly. Felt like staying in for a change. Clara raised an eyebrow. You? Passing up a chance to schmooze with investors? Andrew smirked faintly. Shocking, isn't it? She grabbed a glass from the cabinet and poured herself some water. What's the catch? No catch, Andrew said, setting his phone aside. I just realized I needed a break. Clara studied him, unsure whether to believe him. He wasn't the type to slow down, and the change in behavior felt deliberate. She wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. Well, don't let me stop you from relaxing, she said, turning to leave. Clara, Andrew called after her. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. I've been thinking about what you said last night, he continued, his tone more serious. About the lines we're drawing. You're right, we need boundaries. But that doesn't mean we can't try to make this tolerable. Clara folded her arms. Tolerable? Andrew shrugged. We don't have to like each other, but we can at least get along. She hesitated, then sighed. Fine, but let's get one thing straight. Whatever this is, it doesn't change the fact that we're here for completely different reasons. Agreed, Andrew said, raising his glass in mock toast. To tolerable. Clara shook her head, unable to suppress a small smile. You're impossible. The days that followed were less tense, though far from easy. Clara and Andrew settled into an uneasy truce, finding ways to coexist without stepping too far into each other's worlds. Andrew continued to make occasional appearances at the cafe, much to the amusement of Clara's regular customers, while Clara fulfilled her obligations at his corporate events, perfecting the role of his polished, supportive wife. But despite their efforts to maintain distance, moments of unexpected connection kept cropping up. One evening, Clara found herself wandering through the estate's library, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of books lining the walls. She ran her fingers along the spines, marveling at the collection, when Andrew walked in. Didn't take you for a bookworm, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Clara turned, surprised. And I didn't take you for someone who actually reads these. They don't exactly scream practical billionaire. Andrew chuckled. My mother collected them. She loved the classics. Thought it was important for me to be well-rounded. His voice softened as he spoke, the faintest hint of nostalgia slipping through. Clara tilted her head. "I didn't know your mother. She passed away when I was in college," Andrew said simply. "My father wasn't much for sentimentality, but I kept the library the way she left it." Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. "That's surprising. You don't strike me as the sentimental type." Andrew smirked, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'd be surprised." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Clara turned back to the shelves, her fingers brushing the spine of a leather-bound book. "Do you ever read them?" she asked. "Sometimes," Andrew admitted. "When I have the time." Clara pulled a book from the shelf and held it up. Pride and Prejudice. A classic. "Your mother had good taste." Andrew's lips twitched into a faint smile. "She did." Clara opened the book, flipping through the pages. "Maybe I'll borrow this one. It's been a while since I've read it." "Be my guest," Andrew said, his voice softer now. As Clara left the library, book in hand, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to the man she had married. For all his flaws and calculated precision, there were parts of Andrew McAllister she didn't yet understand, and she wasn't sure if that made her more intrigued or more wary. That night, as Clara sat in her room, reading the opening lines of the book, her mind drifted to Andrew. The man she thought she knew was beginning to unravel in ways she hadn't anticipated. And while she reminded herself of the boundaries they had agreed upon, a nagging question lingered. What would happen if they crossed them? She shook the thought away, determined to stay focused on her own goals. But deep down, she knew the lines between them were already starting to blur, and that neither of them was prepared for what came next. The tension Clara had felt since Andrew's uncharacteristic openness in the library lingered for days. She tried to push it aside, to focus on her work and the looming community center groundbreaking. But the memory of his voice softened by vulnerability refused to fade. Every time she thought of his mother's library, she couldn't help but wonder how much of Andrew's carefully crafted persona was simply a shield. It didn't help that Andrew had been noticeably distant since their exchange. His usual sarcasm and businesslike demeanor returned with full force, leaving Clara questioning whether the connection she had felt was one-sided. One evening, Clara came home later than usual. The cafe had been busier than expected, and she'd stayed to finalize details for the community center's grand opening. She entered the estate to find Andrew pacing in the living room, a glass of bourbon in hand. He was still in his tailored suit, his tie loosened, and his expression grim. "What's going on?" Clara asked, setting her bag down. Andrew didn't stop pacing. "Just another delightful evening with Nathan." Clara frowned. "Nathan? What happened?" Andrew sighed, finally stopping to look at her. "He's been stirring up trouble, making comments about our arrangement, suggesting to others that this marriage might not be entirely conventional." Clara's stomach twisted. "He knows. He suspects," Andrew said, his tone sharp. "Nathan's always been good at reading between the lines, and he's not above using that information to his advantage." Clara felt her temper rise. "So what are you going to do about it?" Andrew set his glass down with more force than necessary. "I'll handle it, but it means we'll have to be more convincing, more public displays of affection, more time spent together. If Nathan catches a whiff of the truth, it won't just damage me. It'll ruin everything for you, too." Clara bristled at his tone. "Oh, so now this is my problem, too? This whole mess started because of you and your ridiculous bet with your friends." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I didn't force you into this, Clara. You agreed to it. For the community center." Clara shot back. "Not to be dragged into whatever power games you and your friends like to play." The room fell into silence, the weight of their words hanging heavy between them. Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure slipping. "I didn't mean for it to get this complicated," he admitted quietly. Clara crossed her arms, still fuming. "What did you expect, Andrew? That we'd go through this year without anyone questioning why a billionaire married someone like me?" Andrew's gaze snapped to hers, his eyes flashing. "Someone like you?" "You know what I mean," Clara said, her voice softening slightly. "We're from completely different worlds. No one was going to buy this without asking questions." Andrew looked away, his expression unreadable. "I underestimated you," he said after a moment. "I thought you'd just play along, keep your head down, and let me handle everything. But you're not like anyone I've dealt with before." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It's an observation," Andrew said, his voice steady again. "One I wish I'd made sooner." They stared at each other, the air between them charged. Clara felt the urge to say something, to push back, to demand answers. But before she could, Andrew turned away. "I'll take care of Nathan," he said, his tone final. "You don't need to worry about him." Clara clenched her fists. "This isn't just about Nathan, Andrew. This is about us, and this arrangement. If you think pretending to care about me in public is going to solve everything, you're wrong." Andrew froze, his back to her. "I never said I was pretending." His words hit her like a slap, leaving her momentarily speechless. Before she could respond, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Clara demanded. "To clear my head," Andrew said without looking back. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Clara alone in the cavernous estate. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing. His parting words echoed in her ears, stirring emotions she wasn't ready to confront. Hours later, Andrew returned, his steps unsteady and his expression clouded. Clara was still in the living room, a half-empty mug of tea in her hands. "You look awful," she said bluntly as he entered. "Thanks," Andrew muttered, collapsing onto the couch opposite her. They sat in silence for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. "Why did you say that?" Clara asked finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "Say what?" Andrew asked, though the flicker of recognition in his eyes told her he knew exactly what she meant. "That you're not pretending," Clara pressed. "What did you mean?" Andrew sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I meant that somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like just a business arrangement." Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but the wall she had built around herself refused to crumble so easily. "You can't just say things like that, Andrew," she said, her voice trembling. "Not when you're the one who made this into a game." "It was never supposed to be a game," Andrew said, his voice raw. "Not like this." Clara shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "Then what is it, Andrew? What are we doing?" "I don't know," he said again, his voice breaking slightly. "But I know I don't want to lose whatever this is." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara wanted to respond, to demand clarity, but the vulnerability in his expression stopped her. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, but the man beneath the facade, a man just as lost and unsure as she was. "Then figure it out," she said finally, standing. "Because I can't do this alone." She left the room, leaving Andrew to sit in the dim light, his thoughts as stormy as the night outside. The next morning, Clara woke early, the tension of the previous night clinging to her like a heavy blanket. She had hoped for clarity, but Andrew's words only left her with more questions. Despite everything, she forced herself to focus on the cafe and the community center's upcoming groundbreaking ceremony. It was the one thing that still felt solid, real. By the time she arrived at the cafe, Lisa was already waiting for her, perched on a stool near the counter with her arms crossed. "You look like you didn't sleep," Lisa said bluntly. "Thanks for pointing that out," Clara replied, brushing past her to unlock the register. She hoped the clatter of keys would end the conversation before it began, but Lisa wasn't so easily deterred. "What happened?" Lisa asked. "And don't even think about saying nothing." "I know that look," Clara sighed, setting the register drawer down. "Andrew and I had a conversation last night." Lisa leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind that leaves you more confused than when you started," Clara admitted. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Confused how?" "Spill." Clara hesitated, then relented. "He said something. Something that made it sound like he's not just going through the motions anymore. Like this arrangement is starting to mean something to him." Lisa blinked, momentarily stunned. Wait. Are you saying Andrew McAllister, Mr. Ice King himself, is catching feelings?" Don't, Clara said, groaning. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Lisa pressed. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like he's starting to care about you. Clara shook her head. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. This marriage isn't real. It never was. But people change, Clara, Lisa said softly. Maybe he's realizing that. Clara didn't respond. She wanted to believe Lisa, but the wall she had built around herself felt too high to let anyone in, especially Andrew. That evening, Andrew came home earlier than usual. Clara was in the kitchen preparing dinner, her movements brisk and efficient as she tried to ignore the storm brewing in her chest. Clara, Andrew said, his voice tentative as he entered. She glanced at him briefly before returning to her task. What? I wanted to apologize, he said, leaning against the counter. For last night. I didn't mean to put you in an awkward position. Clara set the knife down with a sigh. It's not just last night, Andrew. It's everything. This whole arrangement is messy, and we both know it. Andrew nodded, his expression unreadable. You're right. But I think it's messy because it's starting to matter. Clara froze, her pulse quickening. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we need to stop pretending this is just a contract, Andrew said, his voice steady but soft. Because for me, it isn't anymore. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Clara couldn't breathe. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. Andrew, she began, but he interrupted her. I know I've made mistakes, he said quickly. I know this started for all the wrong reasons. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being just a means to an end. You've changed how I see things, how I see myself. Clara stared at him, struggling to process his words. She had spent so long guarding herself, refusing to let this arrangement become anything more than a means to her own end. But now, faced with Andrew's vulnerability, her carefully constructed walls began to crack. What do you expect me to do with that? She asked, her voice trembling. You can't just drop this on me and expect everything to change. I'm not expecting anything, Andrew said, taking a step closer. I just needed you to know. Clara looked away, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself feel something other than fear and doubt. But another part of her, the part that remembered why she had agreed to this marriage in the first place, held her back. This doesn't change the fact that we're still tied to a deal, she said finally. And I can't trust that your feelings aren't just another way to keep up appearances. Andrew's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. I understand, but I hope you'll give me the chance to prove otherwise. Clara didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the cutting board, her hands trembling as she resumed chopping vegetables. Andrew lingered for a moment before retreating to his office, leaving Clara alone with the weight of his words. Over the next few days, the dynamic between them shifted. Andrew was quieter, more reserved, but his actions spoke louder than his words. He began showing up at the cafe more often, helping Clara with tasks without being asked. He also took a more active role in the community center plans, attending meetings and offering his resources without hesitation. Clara couldn't ignore the change in him, but she also couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at her. Letting herself trust Andrew meant risking everything, including her heart. The groundbreaking ceremony for the community center loomed closer, and Clara threw herself into the preparations, using the event as a distraction from the chaos in her personal life. But as the day approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that the tipping point between her and Andrew was coming, and that when it arrived, there would be no going back. The day of the community center groundbreaking dawned bright and clear, but Clara's chest was heavy with anticipation. The event represented the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice, yet her thoughts were clouded by Andrew's recent confessions. She had spent the past week avoiding any deeper conversations with him, focusing entirely on the preparations, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. The ceremony was set up in a vacant lot at the edge of town. Rows of folding chairs faced a temporary stage, and tables of refreshments flanked the event space. Volunteers bustled around, finalizing details as Clara arrived. She was greeted with smiles and words of encouragement, but her mind was elsewhere. Andrew arrived shortly after, stepping out of a sleek black car and surveying the scene with practiced ease. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he looked every bit the billionaire philanthropist the town now saw him as. But when his eyes found Clara among the crowd, there was a flicker of something else, uncertainty. Clara's pulse quickened as he approached her. "You made it," she said, her tone more formal than she intended. "Wouldn't miss it," Andrew replied. His voice was steady, but his gaze lingered on her, searching for a sign of where they stood. Before the conversation could go any deeper, one of the volunteers called Clara to the stage. She gave Andrew a small nod before stepping away, leaving him to watch from the sidelines. The ceremony began with speeches from local leaders, each one praising the effort and dedication that had gone into the project. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she approached the podium with trembling hands. She glanced at the crowd, her eyes landing briefly on Andrew before looking away. "This community center has been a dream of mine for as long as I can remember," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "It's not just a building. It's a promise, a place where kids can feel safe, where families can come together, and where hope can thrive." The crowd erupted in applause, but Clara barely heard it. Her gaze flickered to Andrew again, and this time, she saw him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Pride? Admiration? Whatever it was, it made her heart ache. The ceremony concluded with the symbolic breaking of ground. Clara, flanked by local leaders and a few key donors, picked up a ceremonial shovel and thrust it into the soil. Cameras flashed and cheers erupted, but her thoughts were elsewhere. After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, chatting and mingling. Clara made her rounds, thanking attendees and answering questions about the project. Andrew stayed close but kept his distance, stepping in only when someone asked about his involvement in the center's funding. Eventually, the two found themselves alone near one of the refreshment tables. Clara turned to Andrew, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude and frustration. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done to make this happen." "You don't have to thank me," Andrew replied. "This was your dream, Clara. I just helped make it a reality." She studied him for a moment, her guard slipping slightly. "It wouldn't have happened without you." Andrew hesitated, then took a step closer. "You've done more for me than you realize, Clara. You've made me see things differently, about myself, about what really matters." Clara's breath hitched. "Andrew, don't." "Don't what?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "Don't tell you how much you mean to me? Don't admit that this stopped being about a contract a long time ago?" Clara looked away, her chest tightening. "This is too much. I can't deal with this right now." Andrew's hand brushed her arm, stopping her retreat. "I'm not asking you for anything, Clara. I just need you to know that I'm not the same man who made that deal. You've changed me for the better." Clara pulled away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can trust this." "Trust you." Andrew nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, Clara sat alone in her living room, staring at the ceremonial shovel she had brought home from the ceremony. The day had been a success, a milestone in her journey, but the weight of Andrew's words overshadowed everything. She thought about the man she had first met, the arrogant billionaire who had treated their marriage as a game. And then she thought about the man he had become, the one who had rolled up his sleeves to help at her cafe, who had defended her dreams in front of his peers, and who now stood before her with nothing but honesty. Could she trust that change? Could she trust herself? As the night deepened, Clara knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep running from the truth. Whatever her feelings for Andrew were, they had grown beyond her control, and sooner or later, she would have to face them head-on. The days following the groundbreaking ceremony were a blur for Clara. Between meetings, cafe responsibilities, and coordinating the next steps for the community center, she hardly had a moment to breathe. Yet, no matter how much she tried to distract herself, Andrew's words haunted her. He wasn't the same man, that much was clear. But could she allow herself to believe in him, and in what they might have together? Andrew, for his part, had kept his distance. He remained polite and helpful, but the unspoken tension between them was palpable. When he wasn't working, he was often at the estate's library or away at meetings, giving Clara the space she had asked for. It should have made her feel relieved, but instead, she felt a gnawing sense of loss. One evening, Clara came home to find the estate unusually quiet. She set her bag down and wandered through the halls, finally stopping outside the library. The door was ajar, and inside, Andrew sat at the large desk, his tie loosened and a drink in his hand. She hesitated, debating whether to leave him alone, but something compelled her to knock lightly on the doorframe. Andrew looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Clara." "Hey," she said softly, stepping inside. "Busy?" "Not really," he replied, setting his glass down. "Just going over some numbers." She nodded, crossing her arms. "I wanted to check in. You've been distant." Andrew gave a faint smile. "I was trying to give you space." "It's what you asked for." Clara shifted uncomfortably. "I know, and I appreciate that. But I also think we need to talk." Andrew leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "All right, let's talk." Clara hesitated, searching for the right words. "What you said at the groundbreaking, it threw me. I wasn't expecting it, and honestly, I didn't know how to handle it." "I noticed," Andrew said, his tone gentle. "I didn't mean to pressure you, Clara. I couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore." She exhaled slowly, stepping closer to the desk. "I've been thinking about it. About us. And I keep coming back to the same question. Why?" Andrew frowned. "Why what?" "Why me?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why would someone like you fall for someone like me? We come from completely different worlds. None of this makes sense." Andrew stood, his movements deliberate as he approached her. "It doesn't have to make sense, Clara. Sometimes things just happen. And for the record, you're not someone like you. You're the most genuine, driven, and incredible person I've ever met. You make me want to be better." Clara felt her defenses crumbling, but she shook her head. "Andrew, this started as a deal. A contract. How do I know this isn't just another part of the performance?" Andrew's jaw tightened, his voice soft but firm. "Because the deal doesn't matter to me anymore. You do." Her breath hitched, the sincerity in his eyes cutting through her doubts. For a moment, she considered letting herself believe him, letting herself feel something other than fear. But the scars of their arrangement, of everything that had led to this point, held her back. "I can't," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I can't just ignore how this started, Andrew. And I don't know if I can ever trust that this is real." Andrew stepped back, pain flickering across his face. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready, I'll be here." Clara turned away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Good night, Andrew." "Good night, Clara," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight of her words. That night, Clara sat in her room, staring out the window at the sprawling gardens below. Her heart ached with conflicting emotions, fear, doubt, and a small, stubborn hope that refused to be silenced. She didn't know if she could trust Andrew, but she also didn't know if she could ignore the connection between them any longer. The line she had drawn to protect herself was beginning to blur, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to cross it or hold it steady. Meanwhile, in his study, Andrew stared at the empty glass in his hand. He had laid his heart bare, and Clara had pushed him away. Yet, he didn't regret a single word. If nothing else, he wanted her to know how he felt, even if it meant waiting indefinitely for her to believe him. As the estate grew quiet, both of them found themselves facing the same question. How long could they hold onto the walls they had built before they crumbled completely? The days following their conversation were a delicate dance of avoidance and small gestures. Andrew continued to keep his distance, yet he was always there, offering help when needed, making quiet efforts to support Clara's work at the cafe or the community center. Clara noticed every small act, and it only made her internal conflict grow louder. She couldn't stop replaying his words in her mind, the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability he had shown. Andrew McAllister, The man who had once treated their marriage as a calculated move was showing her pieces of himself she never expected to see. And those pieces were drawing her in, whether she wanted to admit it or not. One evening, Clara found herself back at the estate earlier than usual. She was too restless to stay at the cafe, too tired to distract herself with work. Wandering through the halls, she passed the library and hesitated. The door was ajar, the warm glow of a single lamp spilling into the hallway. She pushed the door open further and found Andrew seated in a leather armchair, a book in his hands. He looked up at her entrance, surprise flickering across his face. "Clara," he said, setting the book down. "Didn't expect to see you home so early." "I needed a break," she replied, stepping inside. She gestured to the book. "What are you reading?" Andrew held it up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Pride and Prejudice. I figured I'd see what all the fuss was about." Clara couldn't help but laugh softly. "You're reading Austen?" "You said my mother had good taste," Andrew said, his smile growing. "I thought I'd give it a try." Clara crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite him. "And? What do you think?" "It's different from what I usually read," Andrew admitted, "but it's interesting. I can see why people love it." They fell into a comfortable silence, the tension between them momentarily easing. Clara glanced around the library, her gaze lingering on the shelves lined with books. It was a world far removed from her own, yet she felt oddly at home here. "Andrew," she said after a moment, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, his tone soft. "Why do you keep trying?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "Why haven't you given up on us?" Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I see something in us that I can't ignore. And because I know I'm not the same man I was when this started. You've shown me a different way of living, of seeing the world. You make me want to be better, Clara." Her chest tightened at his words, the raw honesty in them cutting through her defenses. "But what if I can't believe that? What if I can't let myself trust you?" Andrew exhaled slowly. "Then I'll wait. As long as it takes." Clara looked away, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to let herself feel something other than fear. But the scars of their arrangement, the doubts that had followed her from the beginning, refused to be silenced. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations." His patience, his willingness to give her space, only made her feelings more complicated. She stood abruptly, needing to escape the vulnerability of the moment. "Good night, Andrew," she said quickly, moving toward the door. "Good night, Clara," he replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his eyes. The following week, an unexpected invitation arrived, a formal charity gala hosted by one of Andrew's biggest investors. Clara groaned inwardly at the thought of another event, but Andrew approached her with an uncharacteristic hesitance. "This one's important," he said, holding the invitation out to her. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't." Clara studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but you owe me." Andrew's smile was faint but genuine. "Deal." The gala was held in a grand downtown venue, its halls glittering with chandeliers and packed with Houston's elite. Clara wore a sleek black gown Andrew's stylist had chosen, and as they entered the ballroom, all eyes turned toward them. She felt the weight of their stares but kept her head high, determined to play her role. Throughout the evening, Andrew stayed close, introducing Clara to his colleagues and shielding her from the more insufferable guests. Despite the performance, he never once treated her like a prop. He included her in conversations, listened to her thoughts, and even defended her when a particularly condescending guest questioned her background. As the night wore on, Clara found herself relaxing, even enjoying his company. The man by her side wasn't the Andrew McAllister she had first met, arrogant, aloof, and calculating. This Andrew was warm, attentive, and, dare she admit it, genuine. When the evening finally wound down, Andrew escorted her outside to wait for their car. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the stuffy ballroom, and Clara took a deep breath, savoring the quiet. "Thank you," she said softly, glancing at Andrew, "for tonight. You made it." Easier than I expected. Andrew smiled, his gaze steady. I told you. I'm here for you, Clara. No matter what. Her heart clenched at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where they weren't just pretending. A future where their connection was real. But as their car pulled up, the weight of reality settled over her once again. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? As they drove home in silence, Clara realized the answer was no longer a matter of if, but when. The silence in the car on the way back from the gala was almost deafening. Clara stared out the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass as her thoughts raced. Andrew sat beside her, quiet but not distant, his presence calm and steady. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. By the time they arrived back at the estate, the tension was unbearable. Clara stepped out of the car and walked briskly toward the house, her heels clicking against the stone driveway. Andrew followed a few steps behind, watching her carefully. Clara, he called softly as they reached the door. She paused, her hand resting on the doorknob, but didn't turn to face him. What? Are we going to talk about this? He asked, his voice low but firm. Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping. She opened the door and stepped inside, leaving it open for him to follow. He did, closing it gently behind him as she moved to the living room, kicking off her heels and sinking onto the couch. What do you want me to say, Andrew? She asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. That I don't know what to do? That I'm scared? Because I am. Andrew sat down across from her, his expression calm but intense. I'm scared too, he admitted. But that doesn't mean we should ignore what's happening. Clara looked at him, surprised by his candor. You're scared? Of course I am, Andrew said. This isn't just business anymore. This is real. And I've never done real before. Not like this. His words hit her like a wave, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability behind his polished exterior. The Andrew McAllister she thought she knew. The man who thrived on control and precision was unraveling before her eyes. Clara leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Andrew, I don't know if I can trust this. Trust us. Why not? He asked gently. Because of how this started, she said, her voice trembling. Because this wasn't real at the beginning, and I don't know if it ever can be. Andrew leaned closer, his gaze steady. It wasn't real at the beginning. You're right. But it is now. At least, it is for me. Clara looked away, tears pricking her eyes. How can I believe that? Andrew reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. Because I'm here, Clara. I've been here. And I'm not going anywhere. The weight of his words, the sincerity in his voice, broke something inside her. The walls she had built to protect herself began to crumble, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the emotions she had been burying for months. I want to believe you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I'm afraid. Andrew's grip on her hand tightened slightly. I'm afraid too, but I'm willing to fight for this. For us. If you are. Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She searched his eyes for any trace of doubt, but all she saw was raw, unguarded truth. I don't know where this will lead, she said softly, but I want to try. Andrew's expression softened, relief washing over his face. That's all I need. The weeks that followed were a tentative dance of rebuilding and rediscovery. Clara and Andrew worked together not out of obligation, but out of a shared desire to find something real in the mess they had created. They spent more time talking, real conversations that delved into their fears, their hopes, and their dreams. Andrew began to show Clara parts of himself he had hidden from the world. Stories of his late mother, his struggles with his father's expectations, and his own doubts about the life he had built. In turn, Clara shared her past. The hardships she had faced growing up, the reasons behind her fierce dedication to the community center, and her fear of losing herself in the whirlwind of their arrangement. Slowly but surely, trust began to take root between them. The community center's grand opening was the first major event they attended as a team, not just as partners in name, but as something more. Clara watched as Andrew mingled with the locals, his usual sharpness replaced by genuine warmth. He helped hand out refreshments, posed for pictures with the kids, and even gave a short speech about the importance of giving back. When he stepped off the stage, Clara approached him, her heart swelling with emotion. "You were incredible," she said, her voice soft. Andrew smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I learned from the best." Clara laughed, the sound light and genuine. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were heading in the right direction. That night, back at the estate, Clara stood in the garden, the cool night air wrapping around her like a blanket. Andrew joined her, his hands tucked into his pockets as he gazed up at the stars. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Any of it?" Clara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I thought I would," she admitted. "But no, I don't." Andrew met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "Neither do I." They stood there in silence for a moment, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. Then, without thinking, Clara stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I think," she said softly, her voice trembling, "that we might be okay." Andrew smiled, his hand reaching for hers. "I think so too." And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. This story shows us that love can sometimes bloom in the most unexpected places. But what about you? Are you ready to believe in second chances and the power of transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to check out the upcoming videos on the channel. We've got even more incredible stories and inspiring reflections waiting for you. Stay tuned.